I want to be careful about how I tell this, not because I'm afraid of being called a liar. I stopped caring about that a long time ago, but because the man this story is really about can't tell it himself. His name was Raymond. He was 54 years old, a former wildlife biologist with the U.S. Forest Service who had spent the last decade of his career doing independent field research in the upper Midwest. He disappeared in early November of 2021 in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin. The official search lasted 11 days. They found his truck on a service road off County Highway M, his camp gear partially set up, his field notebook stacked neatly in the cab. They did not find Raymond. What I'm about to tell you comes from those notebooks, from nearly 40 hours of digital footage he left behind, and from what I witnessed myself during the 4 days I spent in that forest, trying to understand what happened to him. I should say up front that Raymond and I weren't close. We had corresponded for about 3 years through an informal network of researchers who take seriously the things that mainstream biology does not. He reached out to me after reading an article I'd written about behavioral anomalies in reported large predator sightings in the Great Lakes region. We met in person twice. He was methodical, quiet, the kind of man who spoke slowly and chose words the way a craftsman chooses tools. He had no interest in fame or attention. He was interested in evidence. He had been collecting it for 7 years, and in those 7 years he had accumulated more of it than anyone I have encountered in this field. The tragedy is that most of it disappeared with him. The footage he left behind runs to roughly 38 hours of continuous trail camera and handheld video documentation. Most of it is exactly what you'd expect from a serious field researcher. Wide shots of game trails, time-lapse sequences of a waterway at dawn and dusk, careful documentation of track impressions in soft ground, soil disturbance near a cluster of mature red pines that Raymond had designated in his notes as Site 4. I've watched all of it. I've watched the significant portions dozens of times, in different lighting conditions, on different screens, with different people sitting beside me offering different interpretations. I'll tell you what's in them as plainly as I can, and I'll tell you what I think it means, though I want to be honest with you that I'm still not fully certain I understand. What I'm certain of is that Raymond was one of the most careful observers I have ever known, and that what he documented in those final weeks was real. The footage from October 19th was the first thing his sister showed me when I arrived at her home in Wausau to collect his materials. She had watched it herself and had not been able to explain it, and she is not a person who reaches easily for unexplained explanations. She is a retired schoolteacher, practical and grounded, and she handed me the hard drive containing Raymond's files the way you hand someone a problem you have given up trying to solve yourself. The footage from October 19th was captured by a trail camera Raymond had mounted on a white oak at the edge of a logging road that cut through the eastern section of his study area. The camera was positioned about 4 feet off the ground, angled to capture the full width of the road and approximately 30 feet of the tree line on either side. The timestamp reads 2:47 in the morning. The forest is dark except for the camera's infrared illumination, which renders everything in that flat gray-white palette that makes night footage feel both clinical and deeply unsettling. For the first few seconds, there is nothing, just the road, the trees, the faint movement of branches in a light wind that you can see in the upper corners of the frame. Then, something enters from the left. It walks upright. The stride is long, deliberate, unhurried in the way that large, confident animals are unhurried, not slow, but purposeful, covering ground without appearing to exert effort. The figure is tall enough that the top of its head grazes the upper edge of the frame, and the camera was mounted, as I said, at 4 feet. It moves to roughly the center of the road and stops. It stands there for what the timestamp confirms is 11 seconds. Then it turns its head to the right, toward the camera, and it holds that position for another 4 seconds before stepping out of frame in the direction it was already heading. 11 seconds of stillness, and then that turn. I have watched that 4-second head turn more times than I can count, and every time I watch it, I feel the same thing I felt the first time, which is the particular cold that comes not from fear exactly, but from recognition. Whatever is standing in that road is not reacting to the camera the way an animal reacts to an unfamiliar object. It is not startled. It is not curious in the way a deer or a bear is curious. It is looking at the camera the way you look at something you already knew was there. Raymond's notes about this footage are dated the following morning. He writes that the camera position had been active for 61 days without capturing anything of significance beyond the expected deer and turkey activity. He writes that the stride length, measured from impressions he found the next morning in the soft shoulder of the road, was consistent with previous anomalous track documentation at Site 4 that went back nearly 18 months. He writes that the head turn in the final seconds appeared to be directed at the camera itself rather than at any sound or movement in the surrounding forest, and he notes that the wind in the footage was moving from right to left, meaning that if the subject had been responding to scent, it would have turned in the opposite direction. He notes this without further comment. That is how Raymond wrote. He would lay out the elements of something that should have alarmed him and then move directly to the next observation, as if by keeping his language even he could keep his conclusions manageable. Reading those notebooks in sequence, you watch that effort slowly losing ground. The observations accumulate, and the even language starts to strain under their weight, and by the final entries, it is barely holding at all. I arrived in Wisconsin on a Thursday in late February, 4 months after Raymond went missing. His sister had contacted me after finding my name in his correspondence files. She wanted someone who could look at the material without dismissing it, who could tell her if there was anything in those notebooks and recordings that might explain what had happened to her brother. I told her I would try, and I meant it, though I understood from the moment I read the first notebook that trying was likely all I would be able to do. I drove up from Madison in a rental through flat gray farmland that gradually gave way to second-growth forest, and then to the older, denser timber of the national forest itself. The forest in February is stripped of ambiguity. The bare hardwoods let you see farther than you can in summer. The snow holds impressions clearly and honestly, without the confusion of leaf litter or dry soil. I had Raymond's field maps, his GPS waypoints, his notebook descriptions of each site. I'd printed the relevant pages and read them so many times on the drive up that I had passages memorized without intending to. I found Site 4 on my second day, following his waypoints along a service road and then into the trees on foot through about 6 inches of packed snow. It was a cluster of 8 mature red pines set back about 60 yards from the road, with a shallow bowl-shaped depression in the center that Raymond believed served as a resting or observation point based on repeated ground disturbance he had documented across multiple visits spanning nearly 2 years. The snow in that depression was disturbed. Something had been there within the last few days, pressing the snow down in a way that suggested sustained weight rather than a brief contact. Not a deer bedding down. Not a bear, which would have been torpid in February in Wisconsin. Something else, resting or waiting in a place it had apparently returned to many times. The impressions around the outer edges of the pine cluster told a clearer story. In 2 locations on the north side, where the snow was deeper and less disturbed by wind, I found prints. They were large, significantly larger than any wolf track I have measured, and I've measured many, and in both locations, the pattern shifted between what appeared to be 4-point contact and a bipedal stride, as if whatever made them had been moving between 2 modes of locomotion without difficulty or transition. The depth of the impressions in the bipedal sections was notable. The weight suggested by that depth was well beyond what any known bipedal animal in Wisconsin could account for. I spent about 40 minutes at those prints, photographing them from every angle, taking measurements, pressing a ruler into the snow beside them for scale. I was doing the same things Raymond had done in the same place over many months before me, and I was aware of that, and it did not make me feel better. I noted the height at which the bark on 2 of the outermost pines had been scored. Parallel lines, evenly spaced, cut into the wood at a point roughly 7.5 feet off the ground. I pressed my fingers into the grooves and felt the depth of them, felt the cleanness of the edges. These had not been made by a bear, which drags and tears. They had been made by something that applied force in a controlled, linear direction. I stood at the base of that tree for a while, with my hand still resting on the bark, and I listened to the forest around me. It was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a winter morning in an empty wood, but the specific, heavy quiet that Raymond had described in his October entries. The kind of quiet that has a cause. I did not see anything that afternoon. I heard nothing. But from the moment I stepped into the clearing between those pines until the moment I stepped back out and walked to the road, I did not once feel alone. That sensation is not something I say lightly. I've spent significant time in remote wilderness over the past 20 years. I know the difference between imagination and instinct, and I know that instinct evolved for a reason. What I felt in that clearing was instinct, old and clear and unambiguous. Something in those trees or near them or watching from somewhere I could not identify had noticed me the way a predator notices something that has wandered into its territory. Not with alarm, with assessment. Raymond's notes from the weeks preceding his disappearance become increasingly specific about that quality of attention. He documents it across a dozen entries in October and early November, always with the same careful language that keeps emotion at arm's length and lets the facts do their own work. He writes about the smell first, a deep animal heaviness in the cold air near Site 4 that he cannot compare to anything in his experience. Not decomposition, not musk in any form he recognizes, but something that seems to coat the inside of his nose and stay there long after he has left the area. He begins noting it on arrival and noting when it fades, and by the end of October it is present on every visit, which tells him that whatever produces it is spending significant time in that location. He writes about the camera that was turned on its mount, repositioned twice after he corrected it, always rotated by the same angle toward the same empty section of forest. He writes that he began to wonder whether that section of forest was not as empty as it appeared. He writes about mornings when he arrived at Site 4 to find the snow around the outer pines disturbed in a ring, as if something had circled the entire cluster during the night, maintaining a precise distance from the trees, covering the same ground multiple times. He measures the ring. It is consistent across 3 separate occurrences, always the same radius, always the same stride pattern in the portions where the snow is deep enough to hold a clear impression. He writes that this behavior is not consistent with any large predator he has studied. He writes that it is consistent with reconnaissance. He writes that word, and then he does not write anything else for 2 days. The October 29th entry is the one I have thought about most in the month since I read it. It is 3 pages in his close, careful handwriting, which is unusual. Most of his field entries are a paragraph or 2, functional and spare. He describes spending a full night in a blind he had built near Site 4 over several visits, a structure of cut branches and forest netting that he had left in place for weeks to allow the surrounding animals to habituate to it. He brought a thermos of coffee, a handheld camera with a night vision lens, a small notebook for real-time observations, and the patience that 30 years of field research had built into him the way weather builds into old wood. He writes that he settled in at 9 in the evening. He writes that the forest was unremarkable for the first several hours, a barred owl moving through the canopy sometime around 11, a white-tailed doe passing within 20 feet of his position at roughly midnight, the normal low sounds of a northern Wisconsin forest in late October, doing what forests do in the dark. He writes that at 1:22 in the morning, by his watch, the sound stopped. All of it. The insects that had been sporadically audible despite the cold, the distant movement in the brush, the wind that had been steady since sundown, all of it ceased inside of a few seconds, as if the volume of the world had been turned down by a hand. He writes that he has experienced this phenomenon before in the field, and that in his experience it has a single cause. He writes that he raised his camera and did not move. He writes that approximately 8 minutes later, he became aware of a shape at the tree line to his left, roughly 40 feet away, that had not been there before. He writes that it was vertical and very large and absolutely still. He writes that he could not make out detail in the darkness even through the night vision lens, only mass and height and the quality of stillness that is different from the stillness of a tree because it is chosen. He writes that it stood there for a long time. He writes that at some point it was gone and he could not say when, only that one moment the shape was there and the next moment it was not, and he had not heard it leave, had not heard a single footfall or the movement of a single branch, and that the silence after it was gone was the same silence as before, total and imposed, and not his. The November entries are shorter. That is the first thing you notice when you turn the page from October. The handwriting is the same. Raymond was too disciplined for his penmanship to change, but the entries themselves compress. Where October had given him pages, November gives him paragraphs and then sentences, and then on the final 2 pages, something closer to a list of observations stripped of everything except the bare fact of each thing. I have thought about what that compression means. I think it means that Raymond was spending less time writing and more time watching, and I think it means that the gap between what he was observing and what he could bring himself to say about it had finally closed, and that closing it took most of his remaining words with it. The November 2nd entry reads in full as follows. Return to Site 4 at first light. The blind had been moved, not destroyed, not damaged, moved. Relocated approximately 15 feet to the northwest, positioned now with its opening facing the depression rather than the tree line. The netting was intact. The interior contents, his thermos, his spare notebook, a pair of gloves he had left behind on the previous visit, were undisturbed. Whatever had moved the blind had done so without disturbing what was inside it. He writes one more sentence. He writes that he does not know what to do with this information, and then he ends the entry. I sat with that entry for a long time when I first read it. I have sat with it many times since. The blind had been moved, not by wind, not by a bear investigating a strange object and knocking it askew, moved deliberately, repositioned so that it faced a specific direction, with its contents left exactly as Raymond had left them. That fact, more than the footage, more than the tracks, more than the scored bark at 7.5 feet, is the one that stays with me. Because it is not the behavior of an animal that has encountered something unfamiliar and reacted to it. It is the behavior of something that understood what the blind was for and made a decision about it. Whether that decision was territorial, communicative, or something else entirely, I cannot say. Raymond did not say either. He recorded it and fell silent. The last footage that matters was recorded on November 6th, 5 days before Raymond's truck was found on County Highway M. It comes from a handheld camera, not a trail cam, which means Raymond was carrying it himself. The footage runs to 14 minutes. For the first 11 of those minutes, it is unremarkable. Raymond moving through forest, the camera at his side, and occasionally raised to document ground disturbance or track impressions in the leaf litter. You can hear his breathing and his footfalls and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. The forest sounds normal in those first 11 minutes. Birds, wind, the creak of hardwood trunks in the cold. At the 11-minute mark, the forest goes quiet, and Raymond stops walking. You can hear him stop. The footfalls cease, and his breathing slows in the deliberate way of someone consciously controlling it, and for a moment, the only sound is wind. Then Raymond raises the camera. He raises it slowly and points it at the tree line ahead of him, maybe 50 feet away, where the forest thickens into a stand of mature hemlocks, dark enough to swallow the available light. The camera holds on that tree line for 40 seconds. In the footage, in those 40 seconds, I cannot tell you definitively what I see. The resolution is sufficient but not exceptional, and the light is the flat gray of an overcast November afternoon in northern Wisconsin, and the hemlocks are dark. What I can tell you is that there is a section of shadow within that tree line that does not move the way the surrounding shadows move. The branches around it shift with the wind. That section does not. It is still in a way that the rest of the frame is not still, and it is tall, and after about 20 seconds of Raymond holding the camera on it, it turns. Not the whole shape, just the upper portion, just the head. It turns toward the camera with the same quality of movement I had seen in the October 19th trail cam footage, slow and deliberate and entirely without surprise. And Raymond says one word out loud that the camera captures clearly. He says the word quietly, almost to himself, the way you say something when you are finally certain of a thing you have been working toward for a long time. He says the word, and then the footage ends. The battery died, or he turned the camera off. I do not know which. I have watched the end of that footage many times looking for a clue, and I cannot find one. I spent my fourth and final day in the Chequamegon Nicolet retracing the route between Site 4 and the service road where Raymond's truck had been found. It is about 2.5 miles through mixed forest, following a combination of old logging roads and game trails that Raymond had mapped in detail over his years of working the area. I walked it in the morning, in clear, cold weather with the temperature in the low 20s, carrying his maps and a GPS unit and a notebook of my own. The walk took me about an hour and 10 minutes at a steady pace. Along the route, I found 3 locations where the snow had been disturbed in ways I could not account for through any ordinary explanation. Not tracks, exactly. The disturbances were in areas where the snow was too shallow or the substrate too hard to hold clear impressions. But in each location, there was a pattern to the disturbance, a sense of something large having moved through or stopped, and in one location, a hemlock stand about 3/4 of a mile from Site 4. I found bark scored at height in the same pattern I had found at the pines. Same depth, same parallel lines, same height off the ground. I measured it and wrote it down, and stood there for a moment with my pen still in my hand, looking at the marks in the bark. And I thought about Raymond walking this same route in early November with his camera and his notebooks and 30 years of field experience behind him, and whatever certainty he had arrived at by then in front of him. I thought about the word he said at the end of the footage. I thought about the blind moved 15 feet to the northwest, positioned to face the depression, its contents undisturbed. I thought about 11 seconds of stillness on a dark road at 2:47 in the morning, and then that turn. I did not feel watched on that walk the way I had felt watched at Site 4. I want to be accurate about that. The forest was quiet, but not silenced. The birds were present. The wind moved through the trees in a normal way. Whatever attention I had felt at the pine cluster 2 days before was not present on that path, or if it was, I could not feel it, which may not be the same thing. I reached the service road where Raymond's truck had been found, and I stood on the gravel for a while looking back into the trees. The tree line from that road is dense and close, maybe 30 feet, hemlocks and young birch and the occasional older hardwood, the kind of edge habitat that in Raymond's notes was associated consistently with high activity. I stood there for several minutes. I cannot tell you exactly what I was waiting for or what I thought I might see. I was doing what you do when you have followed something as far as it will take you, and you are standing at the place where it ends, and the thing you were following is still somewhere ahead of you in the dark. I was looking. I was listening. The forest did not answer me, or if it did, I was not equipped to understand what it said. I drove back to Madison that afternoon. I returned the rental car the following morning and flew home. I spent the next 2 months writing up what I had found, organizing Raymond's materials, cross-referencing his notebook entries with his footage, trying to build a coherent account of what he had been tracking and what had ultimately happened to him. I cannot build that account. The materials end on November 6th, and Raymond's truck was found on the 11th, and the 11 days of official search produced nothing. No remains, no additional equipment, no evidence that pointed in any direction the searchers were willing to follow. I spoke once with one of the state conservation officers who had participated in the search. He was polite and careful, and he told me that the terrain in that section of the national forest was extremely difficult, with significant elevation change and several areas of dense undergrowth that the search teams had been unable to fully penetrate given the November weather conditions. He told me that disappearances in remote wilderness were more common than the public understood, and that the outcomes were often simply no outcome, no answer, no resolution that the living could hold on to. He was not unkind. I do not think he was lying to me. I think he was telling me the version of the truth that his training and his institution had given him, which may not be the same as the whole truth, but may be the only version he had access to. I have shared Raymond's footage with 3 people whose judgment I trust, all of them with backgrounds in wildlife biology or related fields. I have not told any of them where the footage came from or under what circumstances. I described it as documentation from an ongoing field study and asked them to assess it on its own terms. All 3 identified the October 19th trail cam footage as depicting something they could not classify from any known species. One of them, a woman who spent 20 years studying large carnivore behavior in the northern Rockies, watched the November 6th handheld footage twice and told me that the shape in the hemlock stand whatever she was looking at, displayed postural and movement characteristics inconsistent with any North American predator she had encountered in the field or in the literature. She used the word deliberate. She said the movement was deliberate in a way that was difficult to define precisely, but that she found deeply unusual. She asked me where the footage had been shot, and I told her northern Wisconsin, and she looked at me for a moment without saying anything, and then she handed the camera back and changed the subject. I did not press her. I understood. I have not returned to the Chequamegon Nicolet. I have thought about returning many times, and each time I think about it, I think about Raymond's last entry, which is dated November 9th, 2 days before his truck was found. It is 4 sentences. He writes that he returned to Site 4 and that the depression between the pines was empty, but the smell was present and very strong. He writes that he found a fresh disturbance on the south side of the cluster that he had not seen before, a section of ground cover pushed aside in a way that suggested something had been lying there, pressed flat over an area roughly consistent with a very large resting body. He writes that he collected a sample from the disturbed area, a fragment of material he describes only as organic and anomalous, and sealed it in one of his collection vials. He writes one final sentence. He writes that he believes he is close and that he intends to return the following morning. The vial is not among the materials his sister gave me. Whatever Raymond collected on November 9th left with him and did not come back. I keep his notebooks in a box on a shelf where I can see them from my desk. I have not decided what to do with them. Raymond did not have children, and his sister has told me she does not want them back, that having them in her house was something she found she could not manage. I understand that too. There is a weight to those notebooks that is not entirely about what they contain. It is also about the man who filled them, who spent 7 years following something through the forests of northern Wisconsin with patience and discipline and genuine scientific rigor, and who arrived, finally, at whatever he arrived at on the morning of November 10th. I hope the ending was quick. I hope that what found him did so without the prolonged circling, without the hours of patient watching from the dark that he had documented so carefully in the weeks before. I hope that whatever intelligence was present in those amber eyes, whatever calculation operated behind that slow, deliberate turn toward the camera on a dark road at 2:47 in the morning, extended something like efficiency to the man who had been studying it long enough to deserve at least that. I do not know if it did. I have no evidence either way. I have only the notebooks and the footage, and the depression in the snow between 8 red pines, and the scored bark at 7.5 feet, and Raymond's last sentence, still sitting there on the final page of the final notebook in his careful, even handwriting. He believed he was close. I think he was right.